Some mistakes you can walk back from. Most people screw up by texting an ex at 2 a.m. or putting a massive charge on a credit card they cannot afford. Maeve Sullivan. She screwed up by pressing her mouth against a man who could end her life with a single bored flick of his wrist. It was just a stupid dare. A petty joke in a sticky-floored dive bar to win $50. She didn't know he owned the entire city. She just thought he needed to smile. Neon signs flickered relentlessly outside the bruised, smudged windows of O'Malley's pub, bleeding a sickly pink light over the scarred mahogany bar. Maeve picked at the peeling paper label on her cheap beer, her fingernails chipped with dried flour. Tuesday nights were graveyard shifts for the soul. Nobody of consequence went out on a Tuesday in this part of town, except for grey-faced locals nursing hangovers that had not quite set in, and exhausted workers pretending the world wasn't grinding them into dust. Chloe leaned across the small, wobbly table. Her eyes were entirely too bright, fueled by 2 shots of bottom-shelf tequila and a toxic lack of impulse control. I'm telling you, he hasn't blinked in 10 minutes. It is creeping me out, Maeve. Look at him. Maeve did not want to look. She was bone-tired. Her feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm from a brutal 9-hour shift at the bakery. She smelled perpetually of yeast, burnt sugar, and industrial bleach. All she wanted was to finish her lukewarm drink, go home to her drafty apartment, and sleep until her alarm dragged her back into reality. But Chloe had that dangerous, bored tilt to her chin. "Don't stare," Maeve muttered, keeping her eyes fixed on the condensation pooling at the base of her glass. "He's probably just drunk, or stoned, or having an existential crisis. Leave the poor guy alone." "He isn't drinking," Chloe pressed, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss. "There's a glass of whiskey in front of him, but he hasn't touched it. He's just sitting there, like a statue." Reluctantly, Maeve dragged her gaze away from the bar and looked toward the back corner. The booth was swallowed by shadows, far away from the garish glow of the jukebox. He sat exactly as Chloe described, utterly, unnervingly still. He wore a dark, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place against the peeling vinyl of the booth. It wasn't flashy, but the cut of the fabric screamed quiet, old money. His face was a study in hard angles and exhaustion, sharp jawline, dark hair cropped neat, eyes that looked like old tarnished coins, heavy and dead, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. He looked completely detached from the raucous noise, the smell of stale sweat, and the heavy bass vibrating through the floorboards. 2 men sat in the adjacent booth. They were massive, their shoulders practically bursting from their jackets, and though they appeared to be drinking, their eyes constantly swept the room. $50, Chloe said suddenly. Maeve frowned, turning back to her friend. $50? What? $50 says you won't go over there and kiss him. You are out of your mind. Maeve let out a dry, cynical laugh. I'm not harassing a stranger because you're bored, Chloe. Come on, look at him. He looks like he hasn't felt a single emotion since 1999. Do a good deed. Spark some joy in the man's cold, dead heart. Chloe slapped a crumpled $50 bill onto the sticky table. Plus, $50 is your electric bill. I'll even cover your closing shift on Friday. Maeve stared at the money. Then she thought about the impending final notice from the utility company taped to her refrigerator. She thought about the grueling Friday night cleanup. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. You're a terrible person, and I hate that we are friends, Maeve said. She grabbed the $50 bill and shoved it into her jeans pocket. She stood up. The pub suddenly felt entirely too loud and entirely too small. Her worn sneakers stuck slightly to the spilled beer on the floorboards as she navigated the crowded space. With every step toward the back corner, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The rowdy laughter faded. The temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. As she closed the distance, the two massive men in the adjacent booth noticed her. They moved simultaneously, standing up with terrifying speed, hands hovering near the inside of their jackets. Maeve froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The man in the booth finally moved. He didn't look at her, but he raised a single, gloved hand. One finger lifted. A silent command. Instantly, the two giants sat back down, their eyes tracking Maeve like starving wolves watching a stray sheep. Maeve swallowed hard. The cynical, exhausted part of her brain was screaming to turn around, throw the $50 in Chloe's face, and run out the door. But stubbornness glued her feet to the floor. She stepped up to his booth. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He slowly turned his head, locking his gaze with hers. Up close, his eyes weren't just dead. They were a vast, terrifying void. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a minor, mildly irritating puzzle piece that had fallen onto his table. Before her courage could completely evaporate, Maeve leaned down. She pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a romantic movie moment. There were no sparks. It was a collision of sheer terror and unyielding stone. His lips were cool, completely motionless. He smelled like winter air, expensive tobacco and something sharp and metallic. Iron. Danger. Maeve pulled back immediately, her face burning, her chest heaving as she sucked in oxygen. She expected him to yell. She expected him to push her away. He did neither. He simply sat there, his expression entirely unchanged. His eyes remained locked on hers, dark and assessing. "You have exactly 3 seconds," he said. His voice was a low, rough rumble, like gravel being crushed beneath a heavy tire. "To explain why you just did that." It was a dare. The words tumbled out of Maeve's mouth before she could filter them. She stood there awkwardly, her hands shoved deep into her pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking. The man just stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. The thumping bass of the jukebox behind her felt 1,000,000 miles away. He tilted his head, just a fraction of an inch, his eyes slowly dragging over her, taking in her flour-dusted jeans, her oversized thrift store sweater, the frantic pulse beating visibly at the base of her throat. "A dare," he repeated. The words carried zero inflection. He wasn't amused. He wasn't angry. It was a simple statement of fact, analyzing the data she had provided. "Yes." Maeve swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze, even though every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run. "My friend, the table over there. $50 and a covered shift. I'm sorry to bother you. Have a good night." She didn't wait for a response. She spun on her heel and walked away. It took every ounce of self-control not to break into a flat-out sprint. When she reached the bar, she bypassed Chloe entirely, grabbing her damp coat off the back of the stool. "Wait, where are you going?" Chloe called out, bewildered. "You did it. Did he use tongue? He totally looked like he wanted to kill you." "We are leaving. Now." Maeve grabbed Chloe's arm with a grip tight enough to bruise. "Hey, take it easy," Chloe complained, spilling half her tequila. Behind the bar, Jackson, the usually unflappable bartender who had worked at O'Malley's for 20 years, was wiping down the counter with frantic, jerky motions. His face was entirely devoid of color. As Maeve tossed a $5 bill onto the bar for the tip, Jackson leaned in, his voice trembling. "Are you insane, Maeve?" Jackson hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the back corner booth. "It was just a stupid dare, Jackson," Maeve sighed, pulling her coat on. "He was fine." "Fine?" Jackson's voice cracked. "Do you know who that is? That's Rowan Mercer." The name meant nothing to Chloe, who was currently fishing an olive out of an empty glass. But Maeve felt a cold spike of dread nail her to the floorboards. You didn't have to be a criminal to know the name Rowan Mercer in this city. You just had to be awake. He owned the shipping yards. He owned the local politicians who suddenly afforded summer homes in the Hamptons. He owned the silence of the police force. Mercer wasn't just a gangster. He was an institution. He was the violent, untouchable phantom that kept the city running through fear and sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness. And she had just walked up and kissed him for $50. Maeve didn't say another word. She hauled a protesting Chloe out the heavy wooden doors and into the biting night air, completely unaware of the dark, heavy gaze tracking her departure from the shadows of the pub. The next morning, the world stubbornly refused to end. Maeve stood in the cramped kitchen of the bakery, her arms elbow-deep in sourdough starter. The rhythmic, repetitive motion of kneading usually calmed her. But today, she was a bundle of exposed nerves. Every time the tiny brass bell above the front door chimed, her heart slammed against her ribs. She kept expecting men in tailored suits to walk in and drag her into an alleyway. By 3 in the afternoon, the flour in the air had settled, and her paranoia began to curdle into sheer exhaustion. She was being ridiculous. Rowan Mercer was a billionaire crime boss. He didn't care about a tired baker who lost a bet. She was a glitch in his radar, already forgotten. She wiped her forehead with the back of her forearm, leaving a streak of white flour across her brow. "Maeve, can you take the trash out before you lock up?" her manager called from the front register. "Yeah, on it," she replied, grabbing the heavy black bags near the back door. She pushed open the heavy steel door that led to the alley behind the bakery. The sky had bruised into a dark, stormy purple, and a cold drizzle was beginning to fall, slicking the cobblestones. She threw the bags into the dumpster, the loud crash echoing in the narrow space. When she turned around, her breath hitched. A sleek black town car was idling silently at the mouth of the alley, its headlights cutting through the grey rain. Standing beside the open rear door was one of the giants from the pub the night before. He held a large black umbrella, completely indifferent to the rain soaking the shoulders of his suit. Maeve froze. Her mind raced, calculating the distance back to the steel door. 3 steps. She could make it. She could lock it. Call the police. Then, a second figure stepped out of the car. Rowan Mercer didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who knows its prey has absolutely nowhere to go. He stepped under the umbrella the giant held for him. In the harsh daylight of the gloomy afternoon, he looked even more intimidating. He wore a charcoal overcoat that cost more than Maeve's life insurance policy. He looked down the alley, locking his dark, bottomless eyes onto hers. Maeve stood paralyzed in her flour-stained apron, her cheap sneakers soaking in a puddle. Rowan took a step forward. The giant stayed behind by the car. Rowan walked down the alley alone, the rain seeming to actively avoid him. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The smell of expensive tobacco and cold rain washed over her again, bringing back the terrifying memory of the night before. He reached into the pocket of his overcoat. Maeve's muscles locked, bracing for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a crisp, neatly folded $50 bill. He held it out between his long, gloved fingers. "You left this on the table," Rowan said, his rough voice slicing through the sound of the falling rain. "And I don't like holding on to other people's debts." Rainwater dripped from the rusted fire escape above, hitting the pavement with a rhythmic smack. Maeve stared at the outstretched hand. The leather of his glove was pristine, repelling the drizzle perfectly. The $50 bill sat between his fingers, crisp and entirely unbothered by the damp alleyway. She didn't take it. Her brain was misfiring, frantically trying to bridge the gap between kneading sourdough and standing face to face with the city's most dangerous apex predator. "I left it on the table," Maeve finally managed to say. Her voice was raspy, completely lacking the defiant edge she wanted it to have. "It was for your drinks, since I disturbed you." Rowan remained perfectly still. "I didn't order a drink." The bartender placed it there out of a misplaced sense of obligation, and I do not accept charity from strangers in dive bars. Maeve felt a bizarre flare of irritation cut through her paralyzing terror. She worked a double shift to make rent. This man probably made $50 every time he drew breath. "It's $50, she said, wiping her wet face with the back of her wrist, leaving another streak of flour across her cheek. "Throw it in the trash if you don't want it. You didn't need to track me down at my job like a debt collector." "I didn't track you down to return your money, Maeve." Hearing her name in his mouth sent a physical jolt down her spine. It sounded heavy, deliberate. He said it like he had spent the entire night rolling the syllables around in his head. "Then why are you here?" she asked, wrapping her arms around her chest. The cold was seeping through her oversized sweater, settling deep into her bones. Rowan lowered his hand, slipping the bill back into his coat pocket. He took a slow, calculated breath. "Because you made a very public spectacle in a room full of very observant people. You walked up to my table. You put your hands on me. You kissed me. Then you walked away, and I let you. I told you. It was a dare. I know what you told me." His eyes narrowed, focusing on her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the brick wall behind her. "But the men watching us don't care about dares. They care about leverage. In my line of work, I am not permitted the luxury of public spontaneity. I do not have friends. I do not have casual acquaintances. Anyone I allow within arm's length is either on my payroll or they are someone I value." The implications of his words dropped into her stomach like a lead weight. The cold rain suddenly felt freezing. "You think someone is going to think I'm... what? Important to you?" Maeve let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Look at me. I smell like yeast and bleach. I have flour in my hair. Nobody in their right mind would look at us and think we have anything to do with each other. Perception is reality in my world," Rowan stated coldly. "A man named Sullivan operates out of the East End. He had 2 scouts in O'Malley's last night. They saw a woman bypass my security, touch my face, and walk away breathing. To them, you are not a baker. You are a vulnerability, an anomaly. And anomalies get investigated." Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like copper on her tongue. Maeve took a step back, her heel hitting a discarded cardboard box. "I don't know anything about you. I don't know any Sullivans. I just want to go inside and finish cleaning my proofing ovens." "You don't have a choice anymore," Rowan said. His tone wasn't a threat. It was a simple, brutal fact. "Until I neutralize the East End crew, they will watch you. They will try to figure out what you mean to me. If they think they can use you to get a message to me, they will." Maeve stared at him, her chest heaving. "So what? You're going to kill me? Is that it? Tie up a loose end?" Rowan actually blinked. It was a minuscule reaction, but it was the first sign of genuine human surprise she had seen from him. A tiny crease formed between his dark eyebrows. "If I wanted you dead, Maeve, you wouldn't have made it out of the pub last night." His voice dropped, losing some of its abrasive edge. "I am here to ensure you stay alive. My men are stationed at the front and back of this bakery. There is a car waiting for you when your shift ends. You will go to your apartment, and they will wait outside. You will go to work, and they will follow." "No." The word burst out of her, driven by pure working-class stubbornness. "I can't have mobsters following me to the grocery store. I have a life. I have bills. I can't be part of some gangster turf war. Your life is currently a liability I cannot afford to ignore, Rowan replied smoothly. He turned slightly, nodding toward the giant waiting by the town car. This isn't a negotiation. It is a temporary security measure. Keep your head down. Bake your bread. Ignore the men outside your door. When Sullivan is handled, you go back to your completely unremarkable life. And I go back to mine. He didn't wait for her to agree. He simply turned his back on her and walked toward the waiting car. The rain seemed to swallow him whole as he slid into the back seat. The heavy door slammed shut with a definitive, wealthy thud. Maeve stood alone in the alley, the cold rain soaking her to the skin. The Blacktown car idled for a moment before gliding smoothly out of sight, leaving behind only the harsh stench of exhaust and the terrifying realization that her life was no longer her own. Friday morning dragged itself into existence with the abrasive screech of a passing garbage truck. Maeve rolled over on her lumpy mattress, staring blindly at the water stains on her ceiling. She hadn't slept for more than 20 minutes at a time. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren felt like a spotlight on her chest. She dragged herself out of bed, her joints aching. She dressed in her usual uniform, faded jeans, a plain grey t-shirt, and sturdy boots. When she opened her apartment door to head to the subway, she almost tripped over a massive man in a dark suit standing in the narrow, dimly lit hallway. It wasn't the man from the alley. This one was older, with a flattened nose and a thick scar running through his left eyebrow. He didn't say a word. He just offered a curt nod and stepped aside to let her pass. "You know my landlord is going to call the cops if you just stand here all day," Maeve muttered, locking her door with trembling fingers. "Landlord's been compensated," the man replied. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. "He's taking a sudden vacation to Florida. Walk, Miss Sullivan." Maeve gritted her teeth. She marched down the 3 flights of stairs, feeling the heavy, rhythmic tread of the bodyguard right behind her. The subway ride was agonizing. The man didn't sit next to her, but he stood by the doors, his sheer size creating a wide, empty circle around him in the usually packed train car. Commuters stared. Maeve kept her eyes glued to her boots, her face burning with humiliation and fear. The bakery offered a brief, familiar refuge, but even that was tainted. She spent the entire day kneading dough with aggressive, frantic energy, jumping every time the front bell rang. Her manager, a weary woman named Clara, didn't ask questions about the 2 men standing on opposite corners across the street. In a neighborhood like this, you learned early not to ask questions about men in suits. By 9 o'clock that night, the display cases were empty, and the smell of bleach had replaced the scent of sugar. Maeve was wiping down the espresso machine, her muscles burning with a familiar, dull ache. She was exhausted. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that bypassed her body and settled right into her soul. The front door chimed. Maeve didn't look up. "We're closed," she called out, wringing out her rag in the sink. "Come back at 6 tomorrow." "I don't particularly like waking up at 6. The voice was low, rough, and instantly recognizable. Maeve froze. She slowly turned around. Rowan Mercer stood in the center of the small bakery. He looked completely incongruous, surrounded by pastel pink walls and cheerful chalkboard menus. He had shed his overcoat. He wore a dark dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing skin etched with faint, faded scars. He looked less like a polished mob boss and more like a man who had just survived a very long, very brutal day. "Your men are outside," Maeve said defensively, crossing her arms over her chest. "They've been there all day. You don't need to check up on me. I haven't tried to run away and join a rival cartel." Rowan didn't smile, but a faint, tired line appeared at the corner of his mouth. He walked slowly toward the glass display counter, leaning his weight against it. He looked genuinely exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bakery. "I wasn't checking up on you," Rowan said quietly. He glanced at the empty glass shelves. "I wanted something quiet. My office is currently occupied by loud men arguing over supply lines. I needed 10 minutes when nobody was demanding a decision from me." Maeve stared at him. She expected intimidation. She expected threats. She did not expect a billionaire crime lord to seek out a closed bakery for 10 minutes of peace. "Well, you're out of luck," she muttered, grabbing a broom from the corner. "I'm cleaning. It's not exactly a relaxing environment." "It smells like sugar," Rowan noted, his eyes following her as she began sweeping the floor. "It is infinitely better than what my world smells like." Maeve paused, resting her chin on the broom handle. She looked at him, really looked at him, stripping away the reputation and the fear. He was just a man. A dangerous, powerful man, but still trapped in a cage of his own making. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. The filter between her brain and her mouth was completely broken by exhaustion. Rowan let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. "I haven't slept in 3 days. Sullivan is proving to be a persistent nuisance." "Is he going to kill you?" "He will try." Rowan's tone was so casual, he could have been discussing the weather. "He will fail, but the process is tedious." Maeve shook her head, walking behind the counter. She opened a small metal tin where Clara kept the day-olds, pastries that were too stale to sell but too good to throw away. She pulled out a slightly bruised blueberry muffin and tossed it across the counter. Rowan caught it effortlessly with one hand. He looked at the muffin, then at her. "Eat it," Maeve ordered, turning back to the sink. "Your blood sugar is probably crashing. You look like a ghost." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, Maeve heard the crinkle of a paper wrapper. She glanced over her shoulder. The city's most feared man was leaning against a bakery counter, eating a stale blueberry muffin in silence. "It's dry, he remarked, after swallowing a bite. "It's a day old. Beggars can't be choosers." Maeve shot back, a tiny involuntary smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Rowan stopped chewing. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The heavy, oppressive silence returned, but this time it wasn't filled with fear. It was charged with something else. Something quiet. Something dangerously human. "No," Rowan said softly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the refrigerators. "I suppose they can't." Saturday morning arrived with the smell of cheap, burnt coffee and the clanking of old pipes. Maeve sat on the edge of her bed, lacing up her boots. Her weekend routine usually consisted of a trip to the dilapidated coin laundry on the corner, followed by buying whatever groceries were on sale at the corner bodega. It was a meager, quiet existence, but it was hers. Today, however, that quiet was shattered by the mountain of a man currently occupying her tiny hallway. Garrison, she had learned the bodyguard's name after offering him a glass of water he flatly refused, was standing exactly where she had left him the night before. He looked like he hadn't moved a muscle, though his dark suit remained impeccably unwrinkled. "I have to do laundry," Maeve announced, stepping out of her apartment with a heavy plastic basket resting on her hip. "You can stay here. Nobody is going to assassinate me over a pile of dirty aprons." Garrison simply turned and began walking down the stairs, wordlessly instructing her to follow. Maeve sighed, a harsh sound that scraped the back of her throat, and adjusted her grip on the basket. The laundromat was a humid, fluorescent-lit cavern that smelled overwhelmingly of artificial floral detergent and damp lint. Usually, it was a place of anonymous misery, populated by tired mothers and hungover college students. When Maeve walked in with a human tank in tow, the usual murmur of conversation died instantly. Garrison took up a position by the front door, crossing his massive arms. He didn't glare at anyone, but his sheer presence was a black hole that sucked all the ease out of the room. Two college kids abandoned their half-dry loads and practically sprinted out the door. Maeve ignored the stares. She shoved her clothes into a rusted machine, aggressively pouring in the cheap powder detergent. She felt entirely ridiculous. She was a broke baker, with a utility bill in collections and a billionaire crime boss's security detail guarding her underwear. It was a tragic comedy, and she was the punchline. She sat down on one of the cracked plastic chairs, pulling a battered paperback from her back pocket. She read the same paragraph 4 times, the words blurring together. "I was told you prefer fiction." Maeve flinched, the book nearly slipping from her hands. She looked up. Rowan Mercer was standing in the narrow aisle between the humming washing machines. He wore a heavy wool sweater and dark denim, a stark departure from the tailored suits. But the casual clothing didn't make him look any less dangerous. It just made him look bigger, broader in the shoulders. "Do you have a tracker on me?" Maeve asked, her voice tight. "Or do you just materialize wherever I am trying to have a mundane weekend?" "Garrison checks in every hour," Rowan replied smoothly. He didn't sit down. The plastic chairs looked like they would snap under his weight anyway. He leaned against an out-of-order machine, sliding his hands into his pockets. "And I needed a change of scenery." "So you chose a laundromat that smells like mildew. I chose a place where nobody is asking me to authorize a shipment or sign a death warrant," he corrected. His tone was perfectly level, but the words sent a cold shiver down Maeve's spine. It was a stark reminder of who she was talking to. He wasn't just an eccentric, rich stalker. He was a man who ordered deaths between coffee breaks. "I don't want you here," Maeve said, leaning forward. She lowered her voice, acutely aware of the elderly woman folding towels 3 rows over, who kept shooting terrified glances their way. "You are scaring people." "I am scaring people. I want my life back." Rowan watched the washing machine tumble her clothes, his expression unreadable. "Your life is exactly where you left it. I am merely ensuring you get to keep living it. By making me a prisoner, by keeping you breathing." He finally looked away from the spinning glass and met her eyes. The exhaustion from the bakery 2 nights ago was still there, a permanent fixture in the harsh lines around his mouth. "Sullivan's men made a move on one of my warehouses late last night. They burned it to the ground. 4 of my people are in the hospital." Maeve's breath hitched. The cynical armor she wore so tightly cracked, just a fraction. I'm sorry. I don't want your pity, Maeve. I want you to understand the reality of the situation." Rowan's voice dropped, becoming a low, gravelly hum that barely carried over the mechanical noise of the room. "The man we are dealing with does not care that you are a baker. He does not care that a dare is the only reason you know my face. If he finds a vulnerability, he exploits it. Brutally. And you are my vulnerability now," Maeve whispered, the realization finally sinking in. It wasn't that she was special to Rowan. It was that she was a loose end he had accidentally dragged into the light. Rowan didn't deny it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white paper bag. He held it out to her. Maeve looked at it suspiciously. "What is that?" "Hush money. It is a fresh cranberry scone," Rowan said, his face completely deadpan. "From a bakery on the west side. I figured since you gave me a stale muffin, I owed you a fresh pastry. I am told it is their specialty." Maeve stared at the bag, then up at his face. The absurdity of it all bubbled up in her chest, manifesting as a short, breathless laugh. She took the bag. The paper was warm. "You bought me breakfast," she said, shaking her head. "I bought a tactical advantage," Rowan corrected quietly. "Hungry people make poor decisions. Eat the scone, Maeve. Your laundry is almost done." He didn't say goodbye. He just pushed himself off the machine and walked toward the exit. Garrison stepped aside to let him pass, then resumed his post, a silent sentinel guarding a woman eating a high-end pastry in a rundown laundromat. By Monday afternoon, the heavy, oppressive grey clouds that had been threatening the city finally broke, unleashing a torrential downpour. Rain sheeted against the large front window of the bakery, distorting the streetlights and turning the city into a blurred, watery painting. Maeve was wiping down the glass pastry case for the 4th time. The bad weather had kept customers away, leaving the shop eerily quiet. Clara had gone home early, complaining of a migraine, leaving Maeve alone with Garrison, who was currently standing outside under the small awning, doing an excellent impression of a gargoyle. The bell above the door chimed sharply. Maeve looked up, forcing a polite smile that immediately died on her lips. The man who walked in was soaked, but he didn't seem to care. He wore a cheap nylon jacket that dripped water onto the clean tiles. He was thin, unnervingly pale, and possessed a twitchy, restless energy that set Maeve's teeth on edge. He didn't look at the menu. He walked straight to the counter, his eyes locked onto Maeve. "Coffee," the man said. His voice was a reedy, unpleasant whine. "Black, of course," Maeve said, keeping her tone neutral. She turned to the espresso machine, her heart beginning a slow, heavy pounding against her ribs. "Quiet in here today," the man observed, leaning his elbows on the glass counter. He tapped his fingernails against the glass. Click, click, click. "Shame. Nice place. Looks highly flammable, though. Lots of paper, lots of flour. One stray match. Whole place goes up like a Roman candle." Maeve stopped pouring the coffee. She set the pot down carefully. The air in the bakery suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "That will be $3, she said, turning around and sliding a paper cup across the counter. The man didn't look at the cup. He looked at Maeve, a nasty, jagged smile splitting his pale face. "You got a boyfriend, sweetheart? A big, tough guy who likes to wear expensive coats? Maybe hangs out in the back of dive bars?" Cold dread flooded Maeve's veins, freezing her to the spot. This was it. The threat Rowan had warned her about. It had walked right through the front door, dripping wet and smiling at her. "I think you need to leave," Maeve managed to say, her voice trembling slightly, despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I just got here," the man purred. He reached into his jacket pocket. The front door didn't chime this time. It practically exploded inward. Garrison moved with a speed that completely defied his massive frame. He crossed the bakery floor in 3 strides. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply grabbed the back of the man's neck with one massive hand and slammed his face directly into the glass pastry case. The glass didn't break, but the sickening crunch of cartilage echoed loudly in the small shop. The man dropped to the floor, groaning, a stream of bright red dripping from his ruined nose onto the pristine white tiles. Maeve let out a strangled gasp, pressing her back against the rear counter. Garrison didn't even look at the man bleeding on the floor. He looked at Maeve. "Get your coat. We are leaving." "I can't just leave," Maeve stammered, staring at the man writhing on her floor. "The shop. Clara." "The shop is compromised. Get your coat, Miss Sullivan." "Now." Garrison's voice cracked like a whip. It was the first time she had heard him use anything other than a dull monotone. Maeve didn't argue. Survival instinct finally overrode her sense of responsibility. She grabbed her heavy winter coat from the hook in the back room and her purse. When she returned, 2 more men in dark suits had entered the bakery. They were hauling the bleeding man up by his armpits, dragging him out the back door toward the alley. Garrison grabbed her elbow, his grip tight but not painful, and steered her out the front door into the pouring rain. A heavy black SUV was idling illegally on the curb, the back door already open. Garrison shoved her inside and slammed the door shut. Maeve scrambled across the leather seats, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She looked up, expecting to see the empty interior of a getaway car. Rowan Mercer was sitting in the far corner of the back seat. He looked furious. The quiet exhaustion she had seen over the weekend was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, radiating anger that seemed to drop the temperature in the car by 10 degrees. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked rapidly beneath his skin. "Drive," Rowan commanded the driver. The partition between the front and back seats slid up silently, sealing them in a soundproof, leather-lined vault. "He came right into the shop," Maeve stammered, wiping the rain from her face with a shaking hand. "He talked about burning it down. He asked about you." Rowan didn't say anything for a long moment. He stared out the tinted window at their passing city lights, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. Then he turned his head and looked at her. Seeing the genuine, unadulterated fear in her eyes seemed to break something in him. The icy fury in his expression fractured. He reached across the wide expanse of the leather seat. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her. He gently placed his large, warm hand over her 2 trembling ones where they were clasped in her lap. The contrast of his rough, scarred skin against hers was jarring, but the heat of his touch was instantly grounding. "I know," Rowan said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I am sorry, Maeve. You are done baking for a while. You're coming with me." The tires of the SUV hissed a steady, monotonous rhythm against the flooded asphalt. Maeve stared down at Rowan's hand, covering hers. It was an entirely bizarre sensation. The man beside her was a criminal, a phantom of the city's underworld, yet his grip was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Her lungs felt tight, restricted by the lingering adrenaline of watching a man's face get crushed into a pastry case. Slowly, she pulled her hands away. She tucked them tightly under her arms, pressing her spine into the stiff leather seat. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, stripped of its usual cynical armor. "Out of the city," Rowan replied, letting his empty hand rest on his knee. He didn't push. He didn't try to bridge the physical gap she had just recreated. Sullivan operates primarily in the industrial districts, but he has eyes everywhere. The bakery was a test. He wanted to see how quickly my men would react. "So I was bait," Maeve summarized flatly. "You were a target of opportunity," Rowan corrected, his tone pragmatic and cold. "If they had managed to take you, they would have used you to demand territory. They know I have a rigid code regarding collateral damage. You are collateral." Maeve let out a dry, humorless laugh, turning her head to watch the blurred neon lights of the city fade into dark, empty stretches of highway. "That is a very clinical way of saying my life is ruined over $50. Your life is not ruined, Maeve." Rowan's voice deepened, carrying a weight that demanded her attention. "It is interrupted. There is a distinct difference. I will handle Sullivan. Until I do, you will stay at my property. It is heavily fortified. Nobody gets within a mile of the perimeter without my security chief knowing about it." They drove in silence for another 40 minutes. The urban sprawl gave way to dense, looming pine trees and winding, unlit roads. Eventually, the SUV slowed, turning onto a private driveway blocked by massive wrought-iron gates. Cameras blinked with small red lights from the surrounding trees. At a silent signal from the driver, the gates swung inward. The estate was not what Maeve expected. There were no gaudy statues, no excessive displays of wealth. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure made of dark stone and sheer glass, blending seamlessly into the rocky landscape. It looked less like a home and more like a high-tech fortress. The vehicle pulled into an underground garage that housed several identical black SUVs. Garrison was already there, stepping out of a trailing vehicle. He looked exactly the same as he had in the bakery, completely unfazed by the violence he had just committed. Rowan opened his own door before the driver could reach it. He stepped out into the echoing concrete space and looked back at Maeve. "Come." She followed him up a short flight of stairs and through a heavy steel door that clicked open with a biometric scanner. The interior of the house was jarringly quiet. The floors were polished dark wood, the walls painted in muted greys. It was immaculately clean, meticulously organized, and entirely devoid of life. There were no photographs, no books on the tables, no discarded shoes by the door. "This is the guest wing," Rowan said, leading her down a wide hallway. He stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. "Garrison will bring your bags from your apartment tomorrow. For tonight, there are unused clothes in the closet. The bathroom is fully stocked. If you need anything else, pick up the phone on the nightstand. It rings directly to security." Maeve stood in the doorway. The room was the size of her entire apartment. A massive, king-sized bed dominated the space, draped in dark, heavy linen. It looked like a luxury hotel room, beautiful but entirely impersonal. She turned to look at Rowan. He was lingering in the hallway, his broad shoulders practically filling the doorframe. The harsh overhead light caught the deep shadows under his eyes. He looked like a man carrying a crumbling building on his back, pretending the weight was nothing. "I don't belong here," Maeve said quietly. It wasn't a protest. It was a simple observation of fact. "No," Rowan agreed, his voice softening just a fraction. "You don't. You belong in a bakery that smells like sugar, complaining about your utility bills and judging my posture. But right now, you belong where you are safe." He didn't wait for her to respond. He gave her a single, curt nod, then turned and walked away. His heavy footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, leaving Maeve alone in a fortress that felt entirely too much like a very expensive cage. Morning bled into the room through sheer, charcoal-colored curtains. Maeve woke up with a violently pounding headache. The high-thread count sheets felt heavy and alien against her skin. For a few blissful seconds, her brain convinced her she was just hungover in her own drafty apartment. Then she saw the vaulted ceiling. She sat up, the events of the previous day crashing down on her. The thug, the blood, the ride in the dark. She dragged herself out of bed. In the closet, she found rows of expensive, neutral-toned loungewear that still had the tags on them. She selected a pair of black sweatpants and a heavy grey sweater, rolling the sleeves up to her elbows. The fabric was absurdly soft, a stark contrast to her usual thrift store finds. Stepping out of the bedroom, the house was just as eerily silent as the night before. Maeve wandered down the hallway, tracing her steps back to what she assumed was the main living area. She passed a set of heavy double doors that were slightly ajar. Inside, she saw a bank of glowing monitors displaying various angles of the property, and two men in tactical gear speaking in low, hushed tones. They didn't notice her. She kept walking until she found the kitchen. It was a culinary masterpiece. Industrial stainless steel appliances, a massive marble island, and dual convection ovens that probably cost more than her college tuition. But it was entirely sterile. It looked like nobody had ever cooked a single meal in it. Maeve opened the commercial-sized refrigerator. It was stocked with bottled water, prepackaged protein meals, and cold cuts. It was the fridge of a man who viewed food as fuel, not comfort. She needed to do something with her hands. The idle silence of the house was making her skin crawl. She began opening pantries, eventually finding flour, sugar, basic spices, and an unopened block of butter in the back of the fridge. 30 minutes later, the sterile kitchen was covered in a fine dusting of white flour. Maeve was aggressively kneading a simple biscuit dough against the marble countertop. The repetitive physical motion was a lifeline. It grounded her. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. You are making a mess of my counters. Maeve jumped, a puff of flour flying into the air. She spun around. Rowan was leaning against the doorframe. He was wearing the same dark trousers as yesterday, but his dress shirt was untucked and entirely unbuttoned at the collar. He held a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand. He looked at the chaotic scene, the flour, the bowls, the butter wrappers, with mild fascination. Your counters were depressing, Maeve shot back, wiping her forehead with her forearm. A kitchen this nice shouldn't look like a surgical theatre. Rowan pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. He set his mug down on the edge of the island, staying clear of the flour zone. He watched her hands work the dough. His gaze was heavy, analytical, but stripped of the intimidating glare he used on his men. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Not really," Maeve admitted. She grabbed a rolling pin from a drawer she had ransacked earlier. "Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that guy's face hit the glass." "Did Garrison kill him?" "No," Rowan answered plainly. "He shattered his orbital bone and his nose. The man is currently recovering in a private clinic, funded by his boss. He will live to be an idiot another day." Maeve let out a long breath, a knot of tension releasing in her chest. She didn't care about the thug, but she didn't want a death on her conscience. She pressed the rolling pin into the dough. "Why me?" she asked, not looking at him. "I believe we covered this. You are a vulnerability Sullivan thinks he can exploit." "No," Maeve interrupted, slamming the rolling pin down harder than necessary. She finally looked up, meeting those dark, bottomless eyes. "Why did you care? A week ago, you were just a scary guy in a booth. If I am such a liability, why didn't you just put me on a bus to another state? Give me a fake name? Why bring me into your house? Why sit in the back of my bakery eating stale muffins?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee mug, taking a slow sip. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the massive refrigerator. "Because," Rowan said softly, setting the mug down. "For the past 10 years, every person who has looked at me has seen a weapon, a bank account, or a target. They either want to kill me, or they want me to kill someone for them. They fear me, or they need me." He took a step closer to the island, his gaze locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "You walked up to me in a dive bar," Rowan continued, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "You kissed me for $50 to pay your electric bill. You looked me in the eye, told me my pastry was stale, and told me I looked terrible. You didn't see a monster, Maeve. You just saw a man." Maeve's breath caught in her throat. Her hands, still covered in flour, hovered over the flattened dough. The space between them suddenly felt incredibly small, charged with a magnetic, dangerous pull. Rowan reached out. He didn't touch her hands this time. He gently brushed his thumb across her cheek, wiping away a streak of flour. His touch was feather-light, completely at odds with the violence she knew his hands were capable of. Before Maeve could process the sudden intimacy, the heavy double doors down the hallway slammed open. Rowan's hand dropped instantly. His entire posture shifted, the soft vulnerability vanishing, replaced by cold steel. Garrison walked briskly into the kitchen. He didn't look at Maeve. He looked directly at Rowan. "Sullivan just made a move," Garrison said, his voice flat. "They hit the south side docks. They blew up the primary shipping container." Rowan's jaw clenched. The momentary peace of the kitchen shattered into a million jagged pieces. He looked back at Maeve, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Stay in the house," he ordered. He turned to follow Garrison, leaving Maeve alone in the sprawling, silent kitchen, the smell of butter and flour suddenly nauseating. Flour covered every inch of the marble island by 4 o'clock. Maeve baked with the frantic, mechanical energy of a woman trying to outrun a hurricane. She made 3 dozen buttermilk biscuits. She proofed 2 heavy loaves of sourdough. She mixed, kneaded, and shaped until her knuckles ached and her fingernails were packed with sticky dough. The sterile, cold kitchen transformed into a suffocatingly warm, yeast-scented bunker. Outside, the sprawling estate remained completely silent, but the internal tension was a living, breathing thing. Men in dark, tactical gear occasionally paced past the open kitchen doors. They carried heavy rifles. They did not look at her. They did not eat the pastries piling up on the expensive cooling racks. They just watched the monitors and waited. Maeve sat on a modern metal stool, staring blankly at the glowing blue digits on the oven clock. 7 o'clock, 8:30, 10:15. Every passing hour tightened the invisible vice around her ribs. She kept replaying Rowan's face before he left. The sudden shift from a quiet, weary man seeking a moment of peace into a cold, calculating predator going to war. He had touched her cheek. He had looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world made of ghosts and targets. And then he walked out to face a man who wanted to burn him alive. Midnight struck. The rain started again, pelting the massive glass windows overlooking the pitch-black driveway. Then a sharp crack of radio static echoed from the hallway. One of the tactical men barked a sharp command. Maeve stood up so fast her stool scraped harshly against the polished wood floor. She walked to the doorway, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her sternum. The heavy mechanical groan of the underground garage doors vibrated through the floorboards. A minute later, the steel biometric door clicked open. Footsteps sounded in the hall. Heavy, dragging, and irregular. Garrison appeared first. His suit jacket was missing. His white button-down shirt was torn at the shoulder, stained with dark grease and wet dirt. He was limping heavily on his left leg, but his face remained a mask of dull indifference. He gave Maeve a single, curt nod as he hobbled past the kitchen toward the security wing. Rowan walked in a few seconds later. He stopped in the doorway, gripping the frame with one hand. He looked completely wrecked. His charcoal overcoat was ruined, peppered with burn holes and smelling sharply of gasoline and ozone. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with rain and sweat. A jagged, angry cut split his left eyebrow, trailing a slow, sluggish line of red down his cheekbone. His knuckles were raw and split open. He didn't look like a billionaire. He didn't look like a crime boss. He looked like a man who had barely survived a car crash. Rowan lifted his head. His dark eyes scanned the kitchen, taking in the flour-dusted counters, the towering piles of bread. And finally, Maeve. He let out a long, ragged exhale. The rigid, terrifying posture he carried like a shield finally collapsed. His shoulders slumped. Maeve didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask who won. The answers were written in the exhausted slope of his spine and the violent state of his clothes. She walked to the massive stainless steel sink. She turned on the warm water, grabbed a clean white dish towel from the drawer, and soaked it. She wrung it out carefully, her hands surprisingly steady. When she turned around, Rowan had moved to the center of the kitchen. He stood perfectly still, watching her approach. He didn't flinch or pull away as she stepped into his space. Maeve reached up. She pressed the warm, damp towel gently against the cut on his eyebrow. Rowan closed his eyes, leaning down just a fraction of an inch to meet her touch. He let out a quiet hiss of pain as she wiped away the grime and grit from his skin. "Sullivan is dead," Rowan said. His voice was a harsh, scraping whisper. Maeve kept her eyes focused on his brow, turning the towel over to a clean spot. "I didn't ask. You needed to know." He opened his eyes. They were inches from hers, heavy and dark. "His crew is dismantled. The east side is quiet. My men are securing the remaining warehouses. But the threat is gone." Maeve lowered the towel. She looked at his split lip, his bruised jaw, the raw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "It's over," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "The anomaly is resolved. The men watching your bakery are gone. You are completely safe, Maeve. The driver will take you home in the morning. You can go back to your job. You can forget this ever happened." He was giving her an out, a clean break. He was handing her ordinary, safe life back on a silver platter. Maeve looked down at her flour-stained hands, then at the blood on the towel. She thought about her drafty apartment. She thought about Tuesday nights in O'Malley's, drowning in cheap beer and crushing boredom. She thought about the $50 dare that had shoved her into the path of a monster, only to find a man underneath. She dropped the dirty towel onto the marble island. "My shift doesn't start until noon," Maeve said, her voice quiet but entirely steady. Rowan's eyes widened a fraction. A flicker of genuine surprise broke through his exhaustion. He searched her face, looking for hesitation, looking for fear. He found neither. "Maeve," he warned, a rough, desperate edge bleeding into his tone. "If you stay now, I won't let you walk away tomorrow. I am a selfish man. I take what I want, and I keep it." "I know," she replied. She reached up, tangling her fingers in the damp hair at the nape of his neck. She didn't hesitate. She didn't close her eyes and pretend it was a movie. She pulled him down and kissed him. It wasn't a dare this time. It was a choice. Rowan let out a low groan, his massive hands gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He tasted like smoke, rain, and sheer survival. The kiss was desperate, bruising, and grounded in the messy, chaotic reality they had crashed into. The cold, untouchable crime boss was gone, replaced by a man holding on to her, like she was the only solid ground left in a burning world. Some mistakes ruin your life. But some mistakes, Maeve realized as she kissed him back, are the only things that actually start it. Thank you so much for listening to the thrilling conclusion of this story. If this intense, grounded Mafia romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. We love bringing these dramatic, human stories to life, and your support means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Share this video with a friend who loves a good bad boy romance, and leave a comment below. Did Maeve make the right choice staying with Rowan? See you in the next one.